If Tokyo is the epitome of everything modern and flashy, Kyoto is the home of tradition and the history of a bygone era. It's the ancient capital of Japan, but it's also the place where that history and culture were preserved and not destroyed. Japanese cities were bombed extensively at the end of World War II, and I won't get into the nuts and bolts of firebombing versus atomic bombing, but just know this. Kyoto was on the list of cities to be bombed, but a decision was made to spare it. Secretary of War Stimson is largely credited with that decision. He knew Kyoto. He'd spent his honeymoon there. And he argued that it would wipe out an irreplaceable piece of Japanese history and culture, and that it wasn't worth what it would do to the Japanese people in the post-war years trying to move on from the war. I'm not surprised Stimson made the plea, but I am surprised that it didn't fall on deaf ears. Every once in a while, you see a little piece of humanity amidst the inhumanity of war. That gives you hope. And it hasn't been lost on the Japanese, apparently. We heard twice from older Japanese on the trip who actually said, "Thank you for not bombing Kyoto." It was weird. It was also weird because, with all due respect, the Japanese people do seem to have some strange blind spots for their history. Just ask the Koreans and the Chinese. But hey, we can all be a little myopic, I guess. Kyoto is home to so many Shinto shrines, Buddhist temples, and Japanese gardens. Shinto and Buddhism coexist in Japan. Shinto is indigenous to Japan and has a history going back seriously like 10,000 years. But ask the Japanese where they got Buddhism from, and they'll tell you it came to them from India. It didn't. It came to them from Korea. From the Baekje Kingdom of Korea in about 550. Historians know that, but the Japanese people don't. When you do decide to be a little mischievous and ask, did it come from Korea along with scriptures and pottery making techniques? They'll just look at you blankly, blinking, totally 404'd out and unresponsive for a moment, just kind of frozen. And then, no, it came to us from India. Oh, okay, you just have to kind of nod and move on. They just can't acknowledge that they got anything from Korea, a country that for so many years they've thought of as subservient, to be kind. Remember when I said that they have these interesting blind spots? Well, there are several of these things that just kept popping up. So much so that it definitely reinforced a preconception that I'd had that they just don't want to deal with a lot of things. Don't get me wrong, I'm not being overly critical of the Japanese. We all have our blind spots. Theirs are just really interesting to an outsider. And since I'd already had this preconception of the Japanese as inward looking, even after these many hundreds of years, when I would see something that reinforced it, it just stood out to me. As I said, Shinto and Buddhism coexist in Japan. Shinto is a spiritual practice, but not a religion. And it doesn't have specific dogma. So they're pretty harmonious in being able to coexist. They have survived better than the coexistence of Buddhism and Confucianism did in Korea and China, in which Confucianism originally coexisted with Buddhism, but eventually sought to stamp it out when Neo-Confucianists just couldn't tolerate it anymore. You know how those Neo-Confucianists can be. But Shinto and Buddhism never had that problem, and still coexist today. And so you'll see Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines everywhere, but Kyoto in particular is full of them. Kyoto is the home of the geisha, although in Kyoto they're more commonly called geiko, but it's the same thing. And the Gion district is an area of Kyoto where you can still find them. Geisha are women who are classically trained in the arts, conversation, hosting skills, and etiquette. And before you get a little smirk or giggle, they are not escorts. or anything edgy or adult-oriented. It's a serious cultural tradition. They work and live in okiya, which are like tea houses. These tea houses vie for reputations as having the most talented, charming, or refined geisha. And an evening there for a party of guests can be quite expensive and has to be booked well in advance. And not just anyone can book. You generally have to be referred by an existing client of the okiya. They have to vouch for you, that you're respectable and can afford to pay. Geishas start as apprentices, or maiko, at around 14 or 15 years old, just after junior high school. They seek an apprenticeship with an okiya, which will be run by an older woman, usually a retired geisha. The maiko generally go live there while in training, like a dormitory. They're trained on musical instruments, singing, dance, calligraphy, poetry, literature, conversation, ceremony, and etiquette. Once they've trained for 5 to 6 years as maiko, they become a geisha and can run the hosting duties themselves. It's very popular for tourists and visitors, both Japanese and foreign, to dress up in traditional dress and walk around and take pictures. You can rent the outfits or buy them. Most people rent them for the day and take their pictures. While we were walking around Gion learning about geisha from our guide, we had another one of these typically Japanese moments. She'd been telling us how traditional and important and respected and talented these women were, and then she made a comment that many parents nowadays don't want their daughters to pursue a geisha career. So I asked the obvious question. Is it because people often associate them with something racier than just entertainers? And is that just a Western misunderstanding, or is it also held among some Japanese? Is it seen as less respectable now? And she just froze up. She didn't answer. She seemed to not even understand the question. And then she just started talking about something else. This type of thing happened quite a bit on the trip. Nate and I even developed a hand motion and phrase for it. And in 1635, this gate over here, while you motion off into the distance with your hand. It's a Japanese thing. This one, though, wasn't a lack of awareness or knowledge. It's an unwillingness to talk about controversial things or things that could make Japan look bad. Now, that last part isn't just the Japanese. You get this all over the world with guides. They want to give you the rosy glasses, greatest place in the world pitch. I get it. They don't want you to have a negative view of their world or come away unhappy with your tour. In fact, I have a standard disclaimer that I usually give to guides when we first meet them, explaining that we aren't looking for the Disneyland sanitized version of the place. We want the good, the bad, and the ugly. That's what we're interested in. Reality. And we aren't going to think less of the place if it's not perfect. We really want to understand the place. I hadn't done that with her, and we really never got that from the Japanese guides. It was really only the foreign guides who would open up and after a while spill the beans and tell you more complicated things. The Japanese guides never really did. This woman did open up a little later, and we had a conversation about the girls going into the business. She said that it has more to do with the fact that most Japanese parents nowadays don't see it as a viable, sustainable, profitable business. It can be, but it's like being a rock star. They could make a lot of money, or they could be throwing their futures away, wasting years with no real hope of a career. Even with their fear for their daughters' futures, there is still a strong sense of the traditional in Kyoto. Even more so than in other Japanese cities, which aren't known for being terribly progressive themselves. But there is an old Japanese notion that the perfect couple is a Kyoto woman and a Tokyo man. The stereotype is that a Tokyo man knows how to earn and is a hard worker, while the Kyoto woman is traditional, will make a nice home, and that these two together represent the Japanese ideal. I'm sure it's more of a sentiment than a practical reality, and I don't know how much the young still view it that way, but it's what we were told anyway. When she did open up a little bit, she was telling us how much she appreciated living in a place like Kyoto, where even more than Tokyo, you felt safe. She told us about leaving her purse somewhere in public overnight and remembering where it was and going back the next day and it was still sitting there. And I told her that I'd seen bicycles in alleys everywhere and not one had a lock on it. She said that it was pretty normal and they never really think about locking one up. But she did open up enough to tell us that things aren't perfect, and that they'd had a time when girls didn't feel safe on trains because creepy guys were taking upskirt photos and groping them, but that it had gotten much better now. I told her about us seeing kids walking around by themselves and how safe it seemed, and that we'd been on a city bus. Sitting next to us was a girl who couldn't have been more than 10 years old, just riding the bus without a care in the world. She said, yeah, it's pretty normal for them to just go wherever they need to go. But she laughed and said that they did have a recent rash of issues where people were going up to kids and grabbing them. I was shocked. This sounded horrible. This didn't sound like the safety I was thinking existed. People were just going up and grabbing kids. This is the kind of thing you hear about in Latin America, people snatching kids off the streets. She was startled and said, oh no, they just go up to them and hug them and then run away. What? They don't do anything to them, they just hug them? She said, yeah, they go up and hug them and then run away. It's still creepy, but we were laughing hysterically. Here I am thinking, oh my God, they're stealing children off the streets in Japan. And she's like, no, they're just hugging them and running away. Nate and I were laughing so hard. Car 54, we have another hug and run. I think it's just old people who are lonely or something. It's weird. And I really don't think it's a big thing, but it was so funny to hear her tell about this recent issue that they'd had. Like, I can just imagine the irate citizenry wanting to know what the city government and police were going to do about this terrible crime spree. We were exaggerating the whole thing for days and laughing about how quintessentially Japanese it all was. Our hotel was great, but had a terrible breakfast, so we were happy to find City Bakery. And the most important cultural moment of the trip was when I introduced Nate to Shake Shack. Right across the street from our hotel was this large covered shopping area, which made just walking around in the evenings fun. It was a great combination of shopping mall, traditional market, and food hall. Kyoto is a stark contrast to Tokyo, but I think they're each a perfect lens through which to appreciate the other. They're both truly representative of Japan, but in entirely different ways. And I think that contrast well illustrates the complexity of Japan.